Janet, thank you for being here and talking to us. Can you tell us something about yourself, a short biography, and then something about your first memories?
Thank you for having me do this interview. It's a real honor to be working with you. It's a wonderful project that you have. I was born in Pacific Palisades in a part of Los Angeles in California, near the coast. Lovely little town which was founded in 1921 by a group of Methodist utopianists from New York. And they found this place, this sweet little place near the ocean and the mountains, sandwiched in a beautiful little place, and they created this town. They settled in tents in 1921 and then grew this very intentional little town, and it became this lovely spot, and I was lucky to grow up there. Had a very nice childhood, and my parents were just teachers, you know, middle-class people, but it was a lovely place, and my friends were very interesting. I had interesting parents as well, and so it was a very rich childhood. I danced a lot. I danced from the time I was 3 years old, and that was a big part of my life, and did well in school. And then we left, my parents, and we left that town, Pacific Palisades, when I was about 18 years old. And by that time, I was very much getting interested in the world. I went to a little college to begin with called Humboldt State in Northern California, and I simply went there because it rained all the time. Northern California, California's a long state, and there's all different kinds of climate zones, and this one is very, very rainy and forests, and I went there really because of that, which is kind of crazy. But I had some wonderful professors there, especially existential Christianity, sort of Teilhard de Chardin and Nietzsche, and you know, I had philosophy, really good philosophy teachers there, and French. And anyway, then that got me to Sweden. So I lived in Sweden for a year when I was about 23 from that college, and that was a fabulous experience. I went to a school in north of Stockholm, in a place called Värdö. And it was great living on my own and living in Sweden, studying there. And then I finished studying and I got a job as a barnflicka, like an au pair, like to take care of kids near Stockholm. And that was incredible. I had 4 kids to take care of, and I'm speaking Swedish. And but I made money. I would sneak away during the day to go clean, to be a maid, to be a housekeeper, around that area. While the kids were in school, I had another little job, and that job, I made a little bit of extra money, and when I was able to go to the Balkans for the first time. So this is, let's say, 1976, and I went with a group of Dutch people whom I had gotten to know, who were folk dancers. And by this time, I had done all kinds of dance. I'd done ballet, seriously, and modern dance, and then I got into folk dance and Balkan dancing. I just loved it. So I went to Transylvania, to Romania, Cluj-Napoca, and then up in the mountains there in Romania, and learned Romanian dance with this group of Dutch people coming from Sweden. I had met these folks, and so that was my first time in the Balkans. And then I went to UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles, and I studied ethnography, ethnic arts, they called it, and got my BA at UCLA. And realized that I wanted to study in the Balkans. So I started going to the Balkans, traveling in the summer by myself as a young woman with a backpack on my back and taking the train around the Balkans. And at that time, this was Eastern Europe, and this was an Iron Curtain, and this was me as an American, very difficult even to get in and out of countries at that time. So then I graduated and then I started my master's degree in dance ethnology at UCLA, and I had to find a theme for my master's research. So I was still traveling around the Balkans, and I've kind of focused on Yugoslavia because it was the easiest place to work. At that time, much easier to be than Bulgaria or Romania. Definitely couldn't even talk about Albania. Forget it. That was completely closed. So I just kept going around looking, going to weddings especially, where people were gathered and I could see their ritual on display, let's say. And then in 1980, I was at Zagreb Smotra Folklorike in Zagreb, which was this gathering of all these groups. And I met the Albanians for the first time. And I didn't really know anything about Kosovo or Albanian dance. I had stayed in Varna in Bulgaria, again in Romania. I had studied in Saraspotok in Hungary. I really was serious about learning all these different dance forms. But I met these Albanians. They were some young kids from Grmov, which is a village near Vitia. And I could see that they were just different than all the other groups in Zagreb. The other ones were all second generation, like they were wearing costumes that the people didn't wear anymore. They were beautiful costumes from whatever, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, other parts of Yugoslavia, fancy, beautiful costumes that people didn't wear anymore. And the Albanians were wearing tirch and plis, and they clearly this was different, and they had Zona Ljodra, and this was really different. And I said, wow, this is something I really related to immediately, to the music and the kind of rawness of it. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't created for the stage like a second generation life of folklore. It was real. I could tell these people this is what they did. And I stayed with these kids for, I kind of hung out with them. And then they said, well, here's our address. Here's our village where we live, Grmov. I still have the piece of paper, Grmov. And so somehow they left, but I somehow made my way down, and I was looking for a town called Uroševac, Ferizaj. And I went on the train by myself. I found this place, and somehow I found my way to this village. And the village was in the middle of a wedding. So there were days of this wedding. So I hung out with all the young women. And I didn't speak, of course, a word of Albanian. I spoke a few words of Serbian and nothing else. And there was a lot of dancing and singing. And I was hanging out with these girls. And actually, this is interesting. I've never told this story in English. Usually I've told people how I discovered Kosovo in Albanian, but I've never actually said these words in English. It's interesting. What was interesting is that when you're in those situations, you are never alone. So these girls were by my side all these days, except for a few moments. I'm with these. I mean, even when you go brush your teeth at the spigot, the water in the yard, or you go to the outhouse, there's always someone with you, and that was very unusual to the Americans. That was not something I had experienced, because we kind of have our space. These people needed no space. That was a big thing. But I was enchanted by everything. This was, now we're at 1980, and we're in a room, not distant, remote villages. This is a village near Vitia, so it's not very remote. But it's shilte, and it's sofra, and it's chai, and jugum, and buk, and pita, and pasul, and so that the aroma, the smells, I still relate. That's still my favorite food, is pasul and lakna, and real village food, and chai and bised and muhabbet, and sitting around shilta in a room with an ojak. That was my first experience of Kosovo, and that's what got me, really, was the sort of a physical experience, and then the people. The particular way they were, in particular language, this Albanian, the sound of the language really drew me. And most of all, the behavior toward each other. So at that time, you're all sitting all the time on the ground, on shilte, cushions. And when anybody comes in the room, everyone gets up to shake their hand, and not a special guest, just a normal person from a neighboring house or something. And that's a big deal. It's very different getting up from off the floor and standing all the way up to say hello, and the long greetings everyone had with each other. This I had never seen before. So all of these factors together made me realize very quickly this is where I wanted to study, because I was really searching for where am I going to live, do my master's research for UCLA. That was sort of the goal. And I found it. I mean, that was it. Then I came to Pristina. They said, well, you go to Pristina to take the train back to go back to America. And at that point, I came to Pristina, and people said, well, you need to go to Shota. You need to go to see the ensemble. So I went, they were rehearsing, and I danced a little bit with the ensemble, met their artistic director, Jamali Berisha, and met the dancers there. And so then I left, and I went back to America, and I worked hard to get a Fulbright stipend, scholarship, Fulbright. And I did. I got the Fulbright. And I was awarded in spring of 1981. So right when the demonstrations were happening, I remember I was just about to get ready to go. And my stepfather came to me. He said, look at the newspaper, demonstrations in Pristina. And I went, oh my God, what now? What is, so I really followed what was going on in 1981 and starting from the demonstration emanating from the convict, from the dormitory, and the young kids, and then the workers, and coming down what would become my street where I lived, Dubrovnikut, and and everything going on with the people losing their jobs, and all the then martial law being declared by Serbia. So I didn't know what to do. So I came anyway to Yugoslavia, and of course they wouldn't let me into Kosovo, no foreigners, 1981. And so I'm stuck. I'm in Yugoslavia, but can't get to Kosovo. So I found an apartment with an old Montenegrin widow in Beograd, Dedinje neighborhood in Beograd. And then I had already been learning some Serbian to work, because when I knew I would work in Yugoslavia, I was learning Serbian at UCLA. So I knew some Serbian. I met Shkelzen Malici, he had a little Albanian library. And so we got to know each other, and I started learning Albanian while I'm living in Dedinje in Beograd. Meanwhile, I'm traveling through Yugoslavia thinking, well, I may never get to Kosovo. So I was getting to know the Vlachs in East Serbia, this particular culture, very, very unique culture. There's Vlachs all over all over Yugoslavia, Greece, but I got to know these Vlachs, and it just didn't attract me at all, the culture. It was not what I wanted to do. Then I went to Montenegro, and I was trying to find Albanians in Montenegro, and I did, in Plav, and it also was not a good experience. It was a bad experience. Being a woman alone was not good in Montenegro. It was dangerous, so I had difficult experiences in these other places. And then suddenly in the fall of 1981, I got a message from Chevchet Plana, who was a professor here, and he said he would be responsible for me. He would be my mentor. So, by the next day I packed up and I was on the train to Kosovo. And I remember arriving, so now it's fall of 1981, and I arrived at the old train station in Pristina, and it was cold and foggy, I remember, and I had no idea what to do, So I go up to the faculty, the English department, because I knew I would find some people who spoke English, because nobody spoke English in Kosovo at that time. Nobody, except a few English professors. And I did, and I met Cemal Morati and Lindita Aliu, and they became my first friends here. And then there were a few, there was an American and a couple of English professors, and they lived up Bregdili, just at the top of Dubrovnikut, and they lived on the side street. And then I found where to live based on them living there, so that's where I established my base, up in Dubrovnik. So this is the beginning now of my life in Kosovo in 1981, and I'm settling in.
I wanted to ask, what was the first thing that drew you to Balkans?
When I was dancing as a teenager, I was doing modern dance, and whenever the music of Dvorak or Bartok Romanian dances, I remember, would come up. I was so drawn to that. I was so stirred, my emotions were so stirred by that music. Now that's not exactly the Balkans, but it was that general area, Eastern Europe. And then I started listening more to Balkan music and started dancing Balkan dance. So it was really that, it was the folklore that drew me. Then I started learning about all the politics and the, you know, the intrigue of Eastern Europe, obviously. But it was first the music, really, that drew me there.
And you said that you had a group of people from Stockholm that you came?
From Holland, yeah. I was living in Stockholm, and somehow I met these Dutch people, and they were on their way to Transylvania for a 2-week dance course in the mountains of Transylvania. And I started doing the men's dancing, and it was very complicated, really great dancing, and the couple dancing, and I loved it. And I still am close to some of those people that I met in 1976 from Holland. They were passionate folklorists and folk dancers that went to the Balkans all the time.
You told me that you decided to study Albanians, and you were more drawn to this culture. And you came here, you settled. Do you have any problems with, I don't know, police chasing you?
Yeah, big time. So I'll go now into setting up life in Kosovo. My first years, so I settled in this neighborhood just off Dubrovnik, and I was in a big fancy house, but I was in the basement. And my landlord was actually from Montenegro, and the wife was Albanian, and one daughter. And so I was sort of their surrogate daughter, but I lived in the basement there. But and they were sort of city people, sort of sophisticated, wealthy people. But my neighbors were all Katunar, all villagers from Ana Moravas and Golak, and the husbands were coal miners. They all worked in the mines, so they had rough lives, but these were beautiful families. And that's who I hung out with, really, every afternoon. I mean, when I was in Pristina, every day having lunch with the villagers, usually, and then having tea in the afternoon and hanging out in those houses, and just that's where I really started absorbing the life. So my introduction to Albanian life was really with villagers in Pristina, but Katunare, you know, and that's why I speak this language, which is really Katunarce, you know, because that's who I was with all the time. And I was also getting to know people at Institute Albanologique, and so getting to know the language was tricky, because first of all, I spoke some Serbian. And so and everybody here used to speak Serbian, especially in Pristina. And so it was easier for them to speak Serbian with me than to wait for me to try to get out a few words in Albanian. So it was that was one thing that was hard. People would revert to Serbian, and so would I. But then it was difficult because you had you had two languages. And at that time they didn't call it standard, they called it letrace, literary language and village language they called them. And one was from Toscan, one was from Geg. So what I was reading, every day I would open Gjurmime Albanologique, me fjallor, with a dictionary, and try to read, and Rilindia, the newspaper, and Kosovaria, the magazine. Those were especially things that I was reading. With a fjallor, ship Anglisht, you know, and I'm trying to make this out. Then what I'm hearing people speak was not that language at all. You know, un dot shkoj, un kam me shkue. I mean, this was, when you're trying to learn a new language, something like Albanian, man, I mean, I knew French and I knew Swedish by that time, and Serbian. But I couldn't figure it out. It was really hard. I had one grammar book, Gjuhës Shqipe, from Albania, prej Tiranas. So I had this grammar book from Tirana, which I would hide because you weren't allowed to have anything from Albania at the time. You know, I kept it very hidden, but that was my little grammar book for kids, Jewish Shqipe. And then I had, you know, Gjurmime Albongjik, and then I had Katunara, and it was very difficult. There was a wonderful Englishman called John Hodgson, and he was an English teacher here, sort of a traditional Englishman, you know, really kind of old style. And he was fascinated, like I was, by Albanian culture and loved going to the villages. And he was really learning Albanian. He was a real language scholar. So we went a couple times, and he out to the villages, and he said, okay, here's the deal, you know, un do të ha buk, un kam me hunger. Dat ha kam me hunger. You know, he sort of showed me what was going on with these two languages. So that was that. At the same time, it was very difficult because wherever I went, the police were following me. Anybody that I met or had a relationship with, they were making them go to the soup. We called it the soup, you know, Sekretariat za unutrašnje poslove. You know, the police station, and they were always calling me in because at that time they assumed nobody knew any Americans. There was this one English teacher who were here for a while, but generally nobody had met any Americans, and they assumed we were working for the CIA, you know. I mean, it really did. So when I started to be able to go to villages, I had to register with the local police as soon as I arrived in a village, give my passport, register, and they would know who I was staying with, and then they were following me, you know. So that time in the 1980s was so, on the one hand, you know, the oppression, you could feel it. It was so bad and so hard, and there was a lot of fear and also a lot of shortages. I remember, where are we going to get milk? There's no milk. Well, I'll send the kids to wait in line for milk, for bread, you know, that was... But I was thoroughly enjoying living here and started to go to the villages. I wanted to go to Opoya and Haas because they're more remote and the traditions there are so rich. But I wasn't allowed to because it was on the Albanian border. I couldn't go there. Also, there was a law that any foreigner working in Yugoslavia, if they went to outside the city, they had to be accompanied by a Yugoslav in their field. So I had to be accompanied by an ethnologist. And that was very difficult because I couldn't really go with a man. I can't travel with a man alone and go and show up in a village. That was not going to happen. That was not acceptable because then I wouldn't be accepted as the kind of woman that they would open up to. And then the women couldn't go because they had to be home at 3 o'clock to make dinner. So it was difficult to go to the field because of lots of reasons. But I started to. So that was my life. It was dancing in Shota, so I became sort of a member of Shota. Every day I would go to the rehearsals there, and then in the afternoons, you know, I would be with my neighbors and learn about Albanian culture, learn the language, and that's how I slowly got my life here. So that I was here for 2 years at that time. Then I went home. And I actually taught in Hawaii. I was teaching at the university in Honolulu. I got a job there for a while. And then I got into Berkeley. So University of California at Berkeley, very well-known university, and got into their anthropology department, really based on my work in Kosovo. I mean, by that time now I had my master's from UCLA in dance ethnology, actually, the master's program, and had a master's and wrote it on actually dance in Kosovo, wedding rituals, and what it all means, all the symbology of ritual in Kosovo. So with that experience, there was a professor at Berkeley who worked in Yugoslavia and really was fascinated by Kosovo and didn't work here, but was fascinated by it. So he really wanted me to be one of his students at Berkeley. Gene Hamill was his name, a fantastic professor. So he was my mentor. Before that, my mentor at UCLA was Elsie Dunnan, who was actually Croatian, and her work was with the Roma in Macedonia and Kosovo, and on the Adriatic coast in Dubrovnik. So she was ethnic Croatian, and she was my mentor. So she also brought me, was interested in me working in Yugoslavia. But going back a little bit, when I decided to work in Kosovo, my professors were saying, no, you can't work in Kosovo because it's too dangerous for a woman to go alone, and nobody knows Kosovo and nobody knows the language. Forget it. And I said, well, that's where I want to go. So I just, even though they said you can't go there, I did anyway. There was no support to go to Kosovo at the time because they thought it was too dangerous, because they had heard about Kosovo and it's Muslim and nobody knows about it. And, that was the attitude about Kosovo at the time. So then I started my courses at Berkeley, and it was fascinating to me because I was learning anthropology theory, basically, and I was in a cohort of 12 students who all were in love with a place. One of my colleagues was working in Nepal, and one in Egypt, and one in Rajasthan, northern India, on legal anthropology. So everybody had their specialties, someone with Native Americans. And so we all had our passion for some place. But I had spent by that time the most time in the field. Others had not really been there yet, and I had been there. So everything we were reading, Levi-Strauss and Radcliffe Brown and Malinowski and Margaret Mead and Clifford Geertz and all all this theory, I was hungry for it because it gave me the tools to understand what I had experienced. So, for example, kinship theory, which is how different societies in the world understand the people in their family and what they call them. For example, in America, a cousin is a cousin, kushari, and this is Djali Ajas, Djali Dayas, but we call them the same name. Why? Because we have the same relationship with them. You have a very different relationship with your Aja and your Daya, especially when people lived in extended families, and you saw your going to Daya, mother's brother, was just, had a completely different experience than you did with Aja, who was an authority, who lived in your house, and there was a very strict order in the family in the old days. And your father, if your father wasn't there, he was Gurbet. Your Aja was in charge of you, and that relationship was very formal. Daya, for fun. You went to Daya to play around, to fool around, So, Djali Dayas, alcoholis, chica tesis, very different relationships. So that is what we call kinship structure. And for example, in America, we share it with the traditional Hawaiian society. They had a similar kind of structure we did, whereas you share it with some other cultures.